Okay, welcome back. So today we will be looking at really the beginning of the end for Rome. Look at the beginning of the Roman Empire after Augustus and some basic problems that were there from the beginning. A quick review of what we covered last week. So the reign of Augustus ushered in what was looked at as the Golden Age of Rome and the period of the so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Whereas Julius Caesar had little patience for the Senate and offended it, Augustus, as we know, went out of his way to be deferential. He did not flaunt his power, but he maintained a modest standard of living and, as we said, wore homespun togas. His preferred title was that of princeps, first statesman or elder statesman. So just as his title referred to elder ex-consuls or ex-senators who dominated the Senate informally, Augustus ruled in a simple, informal way by his auctoritas alone and did not make any official change to the constitution or Senate. So overall, his reforms ended corruption, inefficiency, and brought equality between Romans and non-Romans, between Romans and the Italians, and also between senators and equestrians. Likewise, an important piece of the Augustan Principate was his promotion of the peace of the gods, the so-called Pax Deorum. That's Paxdeorum, the Pax Deorum. The Pax Deorum is the Roman notion of the peace of the gods. Through the proper performance of ritual. Now, we will see the Roman religion is a state religion. It is a civic religion. There is no separation between church and state in the Roman religion. And Augustus placed special emphasis on traditional religion and morality in governing Rome. And even his title itself, Augustus, had religious connotations. So part of his rule was that he was looking out for the good of all. Augustus specifically promoted the idea that the peace and prosperity of the state depended on the pious fulfillment of religious duties, that it was the job of the emperor and his family to keep the peace of the gods. So again, as I said, the Roman religion was a civic religion, an official state religion that was really not about ethical or moral values. It was not about providing questions of ethics or morality. The Roman religion was a civic religion, an official state religion that was thought to bring peace and prosperity and success and wealth to the state and its citizens. Okay, so again, there's definitely no separation between church and state under Augustus. So in this tradition, in this consolidation of the powers of church and state, Augustus became Pontifex Maximus. He became chief priest in 12 BCE, and that was very important because he had let Lepidus, one of the defeated of the Second Triumvirate, hold that office until he died. But when Lepidus died, he took over as head of the church. Of the state religion, rather. So under his reign, he really promoted the peace of the gods and worshiping Romans' traditional gods. He restored over 82 temples, and most importantly, he built what you see here, the altar to peace. This was a monument that was built after he returned from a campaign over victory over the Gauls. It was built in 9 BCE. And it was a monument that showed the emperor and his family worshiping the traditional gods, worshiping the Roman goddess of peace, and really symbolized the return to peace and prosperity after the period of civil war. Also, again, an important piece of all of this is that after his death in 14 AD, Augustus would be officially deified. He would be officially made into a god, just like Julius Caesar. And after his death, Roman citizens were required to pay tribute to the emperor cult. The emperor cult. So this emperor cult means paying tribute, worshiping the deified emperor. And also, like Julius Caesar, a month would be named in the Roman calendar after Augustus. So, of course, July was named after Julius Caesar. The month of August was named after Augustus. So this is very important. After the deification of Augustus, almost all, except the most egregiously bad emperors, would be deified. One of the most popular emperors, Vespasian, who was noted for his wit, realized when he was about to croak on his deathbed, he said, quote, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." So, of course, the tradition is that the emperors became gods when they died. So all but three would be deified, and these three were Caligula and Nero, who were both clinically insane, and Commodius. Commodius ruled from 180 to 192 AD, and he was a very unpopular, eccentric emperor during the 2nd century. Very unpopular with the army because the army chose another more competent man, and we'll come back to him later. Commodus was known as the eccentric gladiator emperor. So again, after Augustus, all but the really bad, clinically insane emperors would be deified. Also, a part of Augustus's reign was the promotion of morality and family values, as we discussed with Augustus's family reforms, which he established through his own personal behavior. Of course, despite the fact that he had had an affair out of wedlock, he divorced his first wife, Claudia, related to Mark Antony, and then married Livia Drusillus, who was also at the time married to someone else. But again, he promoted family values through his own example, even when it caused him personal sorrow. So, for instance, his own daughter named Julia, was forced into an arranged political marriage. She was forced to marry Augustus's leading general, Agrippa. And basically, Julia would have a series of adulterous affairs with her true love. So despite the fact that it caused him great pain, Augustus set a personal example of good moral behavior and austere behavior by actually banishing and exiling his own daughter Julia from Rome after the affair became a public scandal. Now, Julia's adulterous affair was actually of great and crucial importance to the matters of state because, of course, it involved the succession. So under Augustus's anti-adultery laws, the family reforms that we talked about in the last lecture, Julia was actually arrested. It was quite serious. Julia did not love the husband she had been forced to marry by Augustus. She was actually forced to marry two, but she did not love the husband with whom she had children for political reasons, who was Augustus's trusted leading general, a man named Agrippa, and instead she had a string of lovers, Sempronius Gracchus, and to add insult to injury, one of her lovers was none other than the son of Octavian's defeated foe, Mark Antony, Julius Antonius. Now, why does any of this matter? Am I just going off on a tangent? Well, ironically, right, the great family man Augustus had not had, ever, any biological sons. He only had daughters. So his plans for the succession were foiled. He never left a male heir. Now, his plan was that he adopted his beloved grandsons, right, the children of Julia, and his leading general Agrippa. He adopted these boys, their names were Lucius and Julius. He adopted the boys as his official heirs. He groomed them for power. He wanted them to take over. However, sadly, they both died young. under very mysterious circumstances in 4 AD. Now, Roman historians at the time, like Tacitus, have suggested that their step-grandmother, Augustus's wife Livia, may have had a hand in the murder. Now, this is quite something, to murder your very own grandchildren, or in this case, your step-grandchildren. Now, Livia is often depicted as a wily, sort of conniving woman, and clearly she had motivations for doing so, right? So Livia had a child from a previous marriage called Tiberius, and clearly she did not want these step-grandchildren to become the next emperor. She had plans for her own son Tiberius to take over. So in fact, Tiberius would become the next emperor. Tiberius was Augustus's stepson, not the chosen candidate, but Livia's choice. So the point of this story, this twisted story of love affairs, almost of soap opera quality, is to point out the fundamental weakness of the emperor and empire from the very beginning. In the period of the Roman Empire after Augustus, a fundamental weakness from the very beginning is that there was never a clear succession pattern. There was never a clear succession pattern. There were 4, as you see here, competing methods of succession. Now, Augustus, this was typical of his style. He did not write it down. He deliberately fudged it. He deliberately left it vague and flexible. Now, his rationale was that he didn't want the Roman Empire to be locked into any one method. That having a flexible method of succession would allow the best man to rise to the top. So there would be basically 4 competing succession patterns, how to choose the next emperor, that never, were really clarified on paper. So biology, that should be clear. The biological son of the emperor should take over. Did not always produce the best candidates. When the biological sons were chosen, they often tended to be odd, eccentric, decadent individuals. The preferred method, the most Roman, the most Augustan, the most Caesarian method was adoption. This was the most popular. It typically produced the best candidate. This is, of course, what Caesar had used. This is what Augustus used. And again, adoption was very, very common among everyday Romans to provide a male heir for the family. So this was the safest bet, as you could also choose someone based on their merit, not just on their blood. Of course, the Senate asserted its claim to choose the next candidate, as did the army, as did the legions. And this notion of the army becoming kingmaker is a very, very dangerous thing that becomes very volatile under this. Okay, so a fundamental weakness, there's never a clear succession pattern, which will, within a few centuries, plunge Rome into a final round of civil war. So after Augustus, his family rule, and his family is called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Julio-Claudian emperors. So just to make clear, I do not expect you guys to memorize all of these emperors. This is just a survey class, but I just want you to have an overview, a survey, some idea of what they were like. And of course, you can read about them more in your text. But basically, after Augustus, his family rules. And the family, of course, is ruling. The name of the dynasty, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, is referring back to the name of Julius Caesar. So after Augustus, his family, it's basically, sadly, all downhill. To make a generalization, the Julio-Claudian emperors are crazy and eccentric and increasingly corrupt. They lacked Augustus's tact. They lacked Augustus's moral fiber and sort of ethical character. And increasingly, they did not answer to public opinion. The emperor was unassailable, meaning that once he was emperor, you couldn't remove him from office. There was no way to impeach him or constitutionally remove him. There were no constitutional checks on his power. And really, since the Augustan Principate was so vague and so informal, there was no job description of what an emperor actually did. So it was sort of a saying at Rome in the time that the emperor was what he did. In other words, if the emperor wanted to sit around and write poetry all day and not actually govern the state, well, that may have not been popular, but he could do that. And this is what Nero, for instance, did. So again, in the absence of an official constitutional system and written job description, these emperors, the quality of these emperors varied greatly. For instance, so the generalization is that these emperors were, several were clinically imbalanced mentally, not good rulers. I'll just go over two as an example. So Tiberius was very unpopular. He hated Augustus. Augustus wasn't his father. Again, Tiberius is the adopted stepson of Augustus, and poor Julia was forced to marry him. Once again, another marriage that she did not approve of. Tiberius, very jealous of Augustus. He had Augustus's image destroyed in many cases. He was isolated. He was paranoid. He was very unpopular. Tiberius was a man of simple taste, and he didn't play political theater and wear the mask that Augustus had. He didn't provide the people the bread and circuses that they wanted. He wasn't a fan of the extravagant gladiator games. He actually clamps down on the budget spent on these things, and this is one reason why, in the expectation that the people would be provided for by the emperor, that Tiberius was very unpopular. So after he died, the people actually tried to throw his body in the Tiber. The most eccentric of all of the emperors, and you can read more about these two in your text. Both were very suspicious and mentally imbalanced. Perhaps, well, most of all, though, Nero. Ultimately, the most eccentric and mentally imbalanced of all the Julio-Claudian emperors was the last of them, and this is Nero. So Nero came to power through his mother as a teenager, and his reign was really a period of total chaos and decline. He proceeded to immediately murder all of the potential rivals in Rome, all the members of his family, including his cousins and nephews, and this reign of terror wasn't complete until he had murdered the mother, his very own mother, who had brought him to power. So it's interesting, in this period you see the mothers of the emperor emerging as very powerful figures, despite the fact that formerly women had very little power in Rome. Basically, Nero's only concern during his disastrous reign was his dilettantish artistic ambitions. He was obsessed with poetry and playing his lyre. And apparently he wasn't actually very good. He was a dilettante. So his main occupation as emperor was his artistic ambitions, and he built a huge palace containing private theaters, and in fact forced the leading citizens of Rome, the senators, to listen to his bad music and the poetry in the theater, and actually locked him in there. A lot of bad things happened under Nero. There was a huge fire in Rome in 64 AD, and in an act of scapegoating, he blames the fire wrongly on the Christian minority. They did not set the fire. There was also a revolt in Judea in 66 BCE, and which was caused by basically corruption in that province, and required a huge campaign to put it down. Basically, as he goes along, he becomes more and more eccentric, more and more alienated from the Roman people. He was alienated from the Senate and the Roman people all along. Apparently, here's a bit of trivia. Apparently, he loved the games. He loved the gladiator games. He loved watching the gruesome executions. Not a surprise. And he apparently started the tradition of bringing female gladiators into the ring. In any case, he becomes increasingly more eccentric and crazy as his reign went on. He suspected his leading generals of treason and forced them to commit suicide. Finally, after he forces his leading generals to commit suicide, he took his own life, knowing that if he didn't do it, that he would be murdered. His dying words were, "What an artist dies in me." So really, as I mentioned to you, after Augustus, the Roman Empire really goes downhill quickly, and the family of Caesar comes to a very undistinguished end. Not at all the sort of respected princeps and family man that Augustus styled himself. So basically, after Augustus, especially after Nero, this is important, increasingly the emperors ruled in an openly autocratic fashion and discarded the delicate balance of old and new established by Augustus. The mask of the princeps, the mask of the father of the country was discarded. And increasingly, more and more and more as time went on, the army emerged as a kingmaker. So we have this politicized army asserting its right to choose the emperor, setting a very dangerous precedent. Not only that the army is intervening in politics when it shouldn't, but that it creates a major security problem in that the legions are running to Rome to play politics and that the borders would be left unmanned. So once again, after Augustus and especially after Nero, the emperor rules as an autocrat, as an outright dictator, put in power by the army, and increasingly ignores the delicate balance and ignores the Senate. There would be a sort of temporary detour from this path towards autocracy, towards this path of disregarding the old ways, and this is the reign of Vespasian and the 5 good emperors. Vespasian was a commander under Nero, and he was actually the commander that had put down this revolt in Judea in 66 BCE, 66 AD, pardon me. So Vespasian was this commander, and he founded this new dynasty called the Flavian dynasty. His name was actually Vespasian Flavius, so this is where this comes from. This new dynasty, even though they increasingly buckled against the authority of the Senate, painted itself as appealing to Roman sort of middle-class values of simplicity, modesty, and tradition, and basically restored order and stability to the empire after a period of the extravagance of Nero. Okay. For instance, the Colosseum was built at this time to hold 50,000 spectators and was dedicated to the honor of Vespasian by his son Titus. Now, there are many emperors under the Flavian dynasty. We do not have time to go over them all, and that's far beyond what you need to know. What I'm concerned is that you understand the big picture, okay? Just the big picture. But under the Flavian dynasty, we see the continued Romanization of the provinces. So this simply means bringing Roman culture to the provinces, the building of Roman roads, bridges, aqueducts, baths, Roman arenas, gladiatorial games. This is, of course, the high point of the culture of public entertainment, the chariot racing, the gladiator games, other forms of public theater. Also, the borders of Rome continue to expand. So, for instance, the ancient kingdom of Dacia, which is Romania today, was conquered in 106 BCE by the Emperor Trajan. the borders are expanded in the north as well. So Britain, which originally had been conquered partially by Caesar, was expanded to its highest height by the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian built a wall, which is called Hadrian's Wall, which still stands today. But Hadrian, the rule of Hadrian illustrates an important point. These Flavian emperors increasingly spend more and more time out in the field as military commanders. Hadrian spent 12 of 21 years away in the border provinces, expanding Rome's border, but this left Rome dangerously unguarded and the possibility for pretender emperors. So really, the Flavian dynasty is this sort of last gasp of the period of the good, morally upright rulers. In particular, we associate the success of this time with the so-called five good emperors. They were the last emperors of this dynasty, and they were an exception to the characterization of these increasingly corrupt emperors as time went along. So there were a succession of 5 emperors beginning in 96, lasting to 80 AD, and they had the reputation of being hardworking men of good moral fiber who were adopted to choose the next emperor, the next emperor as the most qualified man. But this came to an end with the last of the 5 good emperors, a man named Marcus Aurelius and his eccentric son Commodius. So the last of the 5 good emperors, the military commander Marcus Aurelius, who apparently had a very high moral standard, fathered a son biologically called Commodius. And Commodius was the eccentric individual who was more interested in fighting in the gladiator ring than actually serving as emperor and actually performing his political functions. So under Commodus asserted his right to rule against the claims of the army to nominate someone else. And under Commodius, who ruled, though not uncontested, from 180 to 192 AD, this period of the Roman peace came to an end. The Roman peace came to an abrupt end, and Rome would be plunged into another round of civil war because the army refused to accept this corrupt gladiator wannabe emperor. Now, Commodus is a fascinating individual. I can recommend a book for you if you're interested in him, but he truly fought in the gladiator ring, had art commissioned depicting him as a gladiator, and you can bet that he never lost. Of course, who would let him defeat them? But in any case, after Commodius, the Roman Empire would be plunged into another round of civil war, and now the old ways would be totally forgotten, and officially the army would become kingmaker. So this comes to a head after the murder of Commodus. Commodius was murdered by army commanders in 192 BCE, in fact by an army commander called Severus, Septimius Severus. And this is where we get the name of the last dynasty, the Severan dynasty. So the Severan dynasty would be the last dynasty that rules Rome before basically we have a period of outright chaos and civil war. And the Severan dynasty was very, very different from the Principate of Augustus. By the time of the Severan dynasty, which was founded by a military commander called Septimius Severus, the ways of the Principate would be forgotten altogether. So as we said, under the Augustan Principate, the empire was ruled as a partnership between the empire and the Senate, between the emperor and the Senate. But now, under the Severan dynasty, under these new emperors, the emperor was only ruled with the support of the army, and it would become a full-fledged military dictatorship. So these Severan emperors, and frankly, it's not really important that we know their names, but these later Severan emperors were military men to the core. They are a far cry from the Augustan Principate. They are highly unpopular. The Severan emperors were provincials as well. Severus actually came from North Africa. He came from what is now Libya. So they were not traditional old school Roman blue bloods. They were sort of rough around the edges and supposedly spoke Latin with a North African accent. So generally, this is a very ugly period for Roman history, and there is a very dangerous precedent involved with the notion of army as kingmaker, because not only are the ways of the elders not adhered to, not only is the army becoming politicized and asserting its right to choose the next king, the next emperor, what happens is that it was very common that different legions nominated different men. Of course, the legion in the Danube would nominate their commander. The legion in Gaul would nominate their commander. The legion in Britannia would nominate their commander, right? So what do you see happening? All legions would nominate their commander as emperor. For instance, it only happened that Severus became commander because his legion were stationed here in the Danube, and they were the closest to Rome. And he got there the fastest. But this creates a majorly dangerous situation and security problem. The emperor would come to power, but he would instantly be challenged by competing army commanders who stripped the border regions of troops and allowed foreign enemies to invade and inflict damage. Okay, so increasingly, in this time of the Severan dynasty, the Roman armies would be directed at each other, not at foreign troops, and the emperor would be murdered by the own troops. And this comes to a head in the era of the military emperors. Okay, so basically, within a few hundred years, the subtle, delicate balance of the Principate is undermined. This facade of republican is no longer there, and we have outright military dictators. So just to clarify, students, I am only really concerned that you know the general outlines of these periods. You don't need to memorize the names of emperors. You should know Augustus. You should know Caesar, but for our purposes, this is just a survey class. You just need to see this general trajectory of what is happening. Great, so we will conclude today's lecture by looking a bit about everyday life in the age of Augustus. So far we looked at political developments, the emergence of the empire, and the succession problem. So we'll just conclude by looking a little bit about everyday life during the age of Augustus and afterwards. So what would it actually been like to have lived in the Roman Empire? So as the political situation became increasingly hopeless, what was everyday life like? What were their views on diet, education, health? So since, as we know, women didn't matter politically to the Romans, what did it mean to be a man in the empire after Augustus? So what would it have meant to be a senator in the empire after Augustus? Well, to start with their views on health and the body. Everybody believed in Rome that the perfect body was male. They believed that woman was an imperfect version of the male, and that even women's reproductive organs were simply an inverted version of the male. For instance, the perfect body was male. Everybody knew it, and additionally, they believed that this was so because the male flesh was supposedly warmer and drier than female flesh. The ancient Romans were innocent of the germ theory of disease. They believed that disease was caused by an imbalance of the so-called humors in the body. So these humors were earth, air, fire, and water. Okay, and earth was hot, air was cold, fire was dry, and water was wet. So in your body, you wanted to have the proper balance of these humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry. And illnesses resulted from the proper imbalance, the improper mixture of these forces. Okay, so today we think of disease as an intrusion of foreign or alien substances, toxic chemicals or microorganisms coming into the body. The ancient Romans believed that disease resulted from imbalances within your own body, from these four humors. Again, earth, air, fire, and water, corresponding to the qualities of hot and cold and dry and wet. So again, the Romans believed that the body was poisoned by the byproducts from its own metabolism or from the improper balance of these things. So a proper balance of humors was the result of a proper diet and proper exercise. And Romans referred to this as the proper constitution. Now, typically, the Romans prided themselves on having a simple diet. So in the days of the Republic, the staples were grain, wheat and barley, wine and honey and spices. They loved garum. Garum is a great Scrabble word. I'm not kidding you. Garum was a pungent, sort of spicy fish sauce made of fermented fish and aromatic herbs. And basically, they prided themselves on eating a sort of simple diet, a lot of vegetables, a lot of uncooked food. They ate salads, but not too much meat. So the staple was simple foods, lots of vegetables, and they also ate a porridge of boiled wheat supplemented by beans. Okay, that's for instance what the gladiators ate. I mentioned to you that. They did not believe that, as compared to some cultures, that foods had to be cooked to be consumed, that the sun cooked the food. And for instance, you could eat produce like lettuce or vegetables because the sun cooked it. Wine was the universal drink. They did not drink beer or much water. So traditionally, the Romans ate a simple diet, but later, by the time of Augustus, Romans became more and more indulgent and held lavish, multi-course banquets. It was said that many rich Romans dug their graves with their teeth by overindulging and, in fact, vomiting between courses. The saving grace of the lower classes was that they could not actually afford these rich meals. So literally people died from their overindulgence. Now, in the time of Augustus, really food became a form of conspicuous consumption, and people had multi-course meals eating all sorts of exotic animals you could think of. Ostriches, cranes, ducks, partridges, all sorts of insects and peacocks and venison and boar and all sorts of variations that you might think of. So there was a great debate in the time of Augustus between exercising extreme frugality, self-conscious frugality, or this sort of logic of overconsumption. Again, the traditional ways touted the motto, nothing in excess, nothing in excess. So some Romans, like Augustus himself, practiced discipline and restraint and self-mastery rather than overindulgence that caused some Romans to dig their graves with their teeth. But many wealthy men, by the time of Augustus, staged these multi-course orgies, feasting on parrotfish and pheasant and peacock brains, flamingo tongues, and the sperm of moray eels. Now, of course, you do not need to memorize these things, but the point was among Romans that they believed, many that is, believed that these elaborate feasts of conspicuous consumption were really a corruption of the old moral values. So again, there was a debate. Should the Romans stick to their traditional diet, their simple diet of little meat and lots of uncooked food, or should food be a form of conspicuous consumption? Well, increasingly under the empire, social status was measured by the size of one's paunch. The fatter you were, the more prestigious you were. In terms of clothing and what you might see on the street, of course, the national dress was the toga. The toga was the badge of male citizenship. Men, young boys, that is, officially began wearing togas when they were age 16. Before that, they wore tunics. So to say that a boy takes the toga of citizenship, the toga of manhood, meant that he became an adult at age 16, assuming the toga of manhood. Wearing pants was taboo in Rome. You did not wear pants. Trousers were the badge of the barbarians. And of course, certain colors were restricted to senators and councils and the emperors. Purple was the color only associated with senators and high-level magistrates. Along with this notion of the humors, the proper balance of hot and cold and wet and dry, was the Romans' beliefs about sex, which was very much in line with this notion of nothing in excess. The Romans believed having too little or too much sex was bad, all things in moderation. So if you had too much, you would be cooled down. You would imbalance the humors in your body. So indulging too much in the pleasures of Aphrodite left your body flaccid and weak and apparently unable to digest food. So if overindulgence in eroticism cooled your body down, apparently they believed that this could be restored through baths and massage. There was a great culture of bathing in public in ancient Rome, the public bathhouses. So Romans placed a great value on cleanliness, but the public baths were really important spaces, not only for getting clean, but for mingling with your peers, and in fact, peers of all social classes. Now, with regard to sexuality, again, the Romans believed that having too little sex was bad, that it sort of enervated you, but again, having too much made you weak. Along with this, students always want to know whether Romans accepted homosexuality, given the influx of Greek slaves and immigrants. Well, ancient Rome, it was not so clear-cut. There was certainly not a clear-cut definition of what homosexuality was or heterosexuality was. But what I can tell you, what really mattered was in your choice of partner was class and power. So it was largely considered acceptable for a man to have an affair with someone, male or female, as long as that person having the affair was the dominant sexual partner, right? As long as he played the dominant sexual role. So, in other words, it was acceptable for a senator to have an affair with the slave, be that slave male or female. What was scandalous for the Romans was when you have two men of equal status submitting to each other sexually. That was considered slavish and scandalous, and that sort of relationship would be considered bad, and that sort of person would be labeled an effeminate. So there was a great stress on what sort of relationships were proper. They also believed that these effeminate men spoken in supposedly an enervating voice. They had a certain mincing gait. They tended to tilt their head and remove bodily hair on their arms. For young men, assuming the toga of manhood, there was a great emphasis on public speaking and the art of rhetoric. This was very important for young Roman men. For upper-class Roman men, public speaking was nothing less than a spectator sport, and you distinguished yourself from your peers by your command of grammar, and use of complex metaphors, and committing a grammatical error or using a word incorrectly really could make you the laughing stock of your peers. So overall, a great stress on oration, and typically an older male relative or father would take the young boy who had assumed the toga of manhood around and sort of mentor him and lead him through the daily task. Young men learn Latin and Greek, and again, great emphasis in their education on rhetoric. So the art of speaking and writing persuasively and elegantly. Now, there would actually be public competitions in rhetoric. They were very common, and typically the students studied the great speeches of the past, and oftentimes these competitions took the form of role-playing. So often, after studying the great speeches and histories of the past, often these rhetoric competitions would take the form of historical role-playing, in which the competitors actually gave advice to the great heroes of the past, like Alexander, or Alexander the Great, or Cicero, or Julius Caesar, and they would be expected to sprinkle their speeches, or orations, with quotes from the Greek classics. It was also expected that elite males fulfill the tradition of bread and circuses, just like the emperor did, but on a smaller scale. So in the tradition of the upper classes providing for the lower classes, Roman men were expected to put on games for the people, distribute grain in times of need, and perhaps occasionally release their own slaves as an act of benefits. So that's a little bit about everyday life in the time of Augustus, but gradually there was great concern that the Romans had forgotten their core values and living more lavishly. At this time, it was also discussed that women and even men were wearing more and more makeup and plucking their eyebrows and again, as we mentioned before, eating all of these lavish dishes that weren't so common before. Okay, so next time we will look at the era of the military emperors and the period of all-out civil war, and see what happens with an emperor called Diocletian. Okay, thank you very much.